If you ask, James Lee Burke will tell you his hometown is anywhere between Houston and New Orleans. The author has been described by the Denver Post as America's best novelist. In fact, Stephen King calls him a gorgeous prose stylist. And when asked about who his favorite authors were, John Grisham included his name among Steinbeck and John Irving. James was kind enough to speak with me via phone about growing up in Louisiana and the latest book in his Dave ROBICHEAUX series. Stay tuned. This is Sheauxtime. Sheauxtime is a weekly podcast where I interview some of Acadiana's most inspiring and influential people. To stay up to date with release schedules, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, all under Sheauxtime Podcast. That, of course, is spelled the Cajun way, SHEAUX Time Podcast. Also, if you'd like to sponsor this podcast, get in touch with me at SheauxtimePodcast@gmail.com. Again, Sheauxtime, spelled the Cajun way. And now, on to the interview. Can you hear me well?
Yes, sir. I'm loud and clear. Am I coming through okay?
You are. Let me just make a few adjustments real quick.
All right.
How are you doing?
Go ahead.
No, what were you saying?
Are you in Lafayette?
I am. I'm in Lafayette. Where are you right now? Are you in Montana?
Yeah, I'm looking out the window at snow falling on the pines. I'm in a kind of a remote area, so I'm glad we have a good connection.
No, it sounds fine. Yeah, you're going to experience a real winter. You know, it's probably about 80, 82 right now. Here.
Really?
Yeah.
Holy moly.
What is it over there?
Well, it's nice now, about 33, but by Saturday it's supposed to be 0.
Wow. Yeah, we
That's
actually,
okay.
In classic Louisiana fashion, we actually had a snow day about a week and a half ago. And
I saw some of the photos.
Yeah, and then promptly went back to about 80, 85,
Yeah.
And I'm just hoping that this year's Christmas is a little bit better than last year's. I think last year on Christmas Day, it was about 85, and that's always never a good sign whenever it's like, 80-something on Christmas Day. It just doesn't feel like Christmas.
Yeah. Thank you for being on your show. Is that what's called a podcast? Is that the term?
That's right. It's a podcast. Have you heard of that at all?
Well, I had it explained to me a little bit. It's kind of an interview on the internet.
Right. It's essentially a radio show on the internet where, instead of just hearing it one time if you tune in to the radio station at the right time, it's kind of just, it's available like on demand. So on your, people with smartphones and all that kind of stuff, they can just listen to it, as they would a radio show, but just at any point.
Well, that's pretty nice. That's swell.
So thank you so much for coming on. I know I don't want to take up too much of your time, but
that's all right.
The idea with this podcast, it's called Sheauxtime, spelt like a Cajun would spell it. And and the idea is that I have always looked outward. I grew up in Lafayette, moved to New Orleans for a little while, but I've always looked outward, outside of Louisiana, outside of Lafayette, Acadiana region for to look at success or to find stories of inspiration and all that kind of stuff. And as I've gotten older, I've realized that I've really been mistaken in not appreciating, Louisiana and Acadiana the way it should be, in that we actually have some incredible people that have come out of this area or that are still up and coming out of this area. And so I really wanted to talk with people like yourself to remind myself just of what we really have here. So thanks for coming on.
Well, it sounds like a noble goal you've set, so anything I can do to help, I feel honored to be on your show.
Well, thank you. Well, let's just jump right in. I'm really curious to hear about kind of your history in... now, were you born in New Iberia, or were you born kind of closer to Texas? How did that work out for you?
Well, I grew up in both places, both states. This would cover it. Anywhere between Houston and New Orleans, right along the southern rim of the Gulf Coast, I've lived there, and the biggest influences of my life came from there.
And what was it? I mean, I've read stuff that you've said where it's, especially in your writing, that Louisiana is kind of a gift from God to artists because of the visual, the everything. So were you thinking about that younger as a child? I know you had said also that you began writing short stories kind of in the 5th grade with your cousin.
Yeah.
Was Louisiana an inspiration from the get-go?
Oh, yes. I mean, my heavens, it's the most haunted and haunting place I've ever been. And the great gift of Louisiana to the artist is the fact that the past is still there. You can put your hand on it. And you see, Louisiana, at least in my work, is a microcosm of the macrocosm.
Mm-hmm.
It tells a larger story, I think. So, in other words, everything that has occurred in the United States from colonial times to the present has occurred in Louisiana, but we can still see it. See, like I remember, I used to be a landman for Sinclair Oil Company back in the 50s, and I worked in the courthouses all over southern Louisiana. And in New Iberia, there used to be smoke stains on the pillars of the old courthouse. And that's where the Yankees burned all the records.
Mm-hmm.
You see, many people are not aware of what occurred when southwest Louisiana was invaded by Nathaniel Banks. He swept through there. Ooh, golly, what was the spring of 1863? And he turned his men loose on the civilian population. They behaved in the same way Sherman's people did.
I was about to say, it sounds like Atlanta.
Well, it's very similar. Mm-hmm. In other words, it was a form of terrorism, and it was deliberate, and it was meant to inculcate fear in people, and they did it.
Mm.
Well, they turned Yankees, Union soldiers loose on black women who were raped up and down Bayou Teche. It was terrible, and there were many Union officers, I think, who were aghast at what was occurring. But anyway, the point is, those stories, you see, were still there. I mean, I heard them when I was growing up.
Right.
And see, in our home there on the Laurelville Road, there are still live oak trees that have 58 caliber mini balls in the heart of the tree. And they were fired there in 1863 when 20,000 Union troops marched down that road. They were chasing Lieutenant Colonel, or he was a general then, Mouton, up Bayou Teche into the Red River parishes. You know, and General Mouton was killed there in the Battle of, was it Natchitoches?
Right.
But at 1864. But the point is, all that hit, you can put your hand on one of those trees today, and it's like you can feel a heart beating inside of it. There's a mini ball buried inside that tree that was fired by somebody. You know where Nelson's Canal is in New Iberia?
I don't think I've ever been. I have heard of it, though.
It's a drainage. It's a slough that runs into Bayou Teche. But I remember when I was a little boy, my father and I were hunting for mini balls in a chicken yard there, and there was a plantation home that had been vandalized by Union soldiers, and there were still pieces of broken china in the chicken yard, and there were mini balls. I'm looking at 3 of them. I have 3 right here on my desk that my father picked up back in the 1940s. But in other words, I didn't have to read about the past. Remember what William Faulkner said, the past is not even the past. It was still there. And my father, there was a gunboat. There was a Union gunboat sunk right there in the mudflat, sticking out of the mud right there on the bridge by Nelson's Canal, and my father pulled a big spike out of one of the timbers, and all that wood is gone now. But a few years ago, the engine of the ship was found. It was dredged out of the bayou. But I saw all that back in 1941, January of 1941.
So you were a young boy. I mean, you felt it. It was there. You know, you didn't have to look far at all to get that inspiration.
Well, you know, it's a remarkable experience. I mean, to be able, there were still slave quarters on the back of the properties along Bayou Teche when I was a little boy. You know where Albania Plantation is in Jeanerette?
Yes, I do, yeah.
Well, there's slave quarters there that have been deliberately, I guess, restored and kept intact for whatever reason. But there were shacks along the bayou when I was a little boy that had been the homes of slaves. And so those things were still visible. And they're not today, of course.
Right. Well, I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about that, because I know I've also heard you talk about the Confederacy in general and how the Confederate flag itself was not a symbol that people are making out to be, and that the biggest crime would that it got into the hands of evil people.
Yes.
Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, the first person I heard say that was Shelby Foote, the historian from Memphis. He narrated much of the Ken Burns series about the war between the states. Mm-hmm. And he said that the sin is not the flags, it is the fact we have allowed evil men to acquire it. And it's just terribly unfortunate. And I think sometimes, well, those things happen, of course, and we can't undo what has been done. But you see, Robert Lee was nothing like the men today who raise that flag in their parades, and as they, these alt-right guys, they're neo-fascists. I mean, I think men like Robert E. Lee and Thomas Jackson and John Bell Hood would just be sickened at the thought that people like this, they're misanthropes, have acquired the battle flag of the Army of Northern Virginia.
Right.
But I think we need to be aware of that, for God's sakes. Don't denigrate men who themselves would have been disgusted with the people who have stolen their flag, because that's what it amounts to. Mm-hmm. You say, but I guess is what I'm really saying. I'm sorry, I got something in my throat. Do you mind if I call you by your first name?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, okay. All right. Excuse me, I just ate some tortillas.
Oh, that sounds delicious. No, I got my cup of water with me right now, and I have to take a sip every once in a while too.
Anyway, the issue, and have you been able to read ROBICHEAUX, the new book? Did the publishers?
They did. They got it to me, and I've been able to get through about half of it so far. But I'm looking forward to finishing it over the holidays, so it's going to be a good holiday read.
The only reason I ask is that in the end of the book, Dave ROBICHEAUX talks about the issue you just raised, and this is my own feeling, and it's just one man's opinion, but I think the people who want to take down monuments or to take down flags, they have good hearts. Their hearts are in the right place, but I think some of them are both misinformed and misled. They're good people, and I prefer their company than I would their antagonists. Right. But I think they play into the hands of people like Steve Bannon and Donald Trump, and I think it's a big mistake on their part. But as I say, their heart's in the right place. Mm-hmm. But we have seen in our lifetime a resurgence, a blatant resurgence of nativism, what was called the Know Nothing Party, and neo-fascism, and it's the real deal.
I know. I mean, coming from
no one can put another hat on it. They don't hide it. They are racist. They're misogynist. They want to create a dictatorship. They call it. They use different terms for it, but we've got an embryonic dictatorship in the making. That's my feeling. But to play into their hands is a terrible mistake. Same thing the Taliban and ISIS do. They try to destroy the past. Leave it alone. That would be my advice. But I as I say, I think these are good people. People want to, they object to the flag, but I don't think with people of color there's ever been an issue. I never knew a person of color in my life who could care one way or another what people did with the Confederate flag. But anyway, it's probably not. It's I'm sorry. What's your first name?
It's Brennan.
Yeah, Brennan. I'm sorry, Brennan. What it amounts to, Brennan, is don't take the bait. Don't get pulled into it. Don't catch your necktie in a garbage grinder, because it's not. These are emotional issues, and eventually, these men who are hateful and they're violent, and they're all cut out of the same cloth. They're bullies. And they pick on the weak and the defenseless, and they're an embarrassment. But they're on the wrong side of history, and they know it. And that's why they behave in the way they do. They'll be consumed by their own evil. Evil always consumes itself. You don't have to. It's a mistake to empower them.
Mm-hmm. Well, and as history has shown, history will bring justice.
That's it. There you go.
Well, if you don't mind, I'd like to move on to a little bit of a lighter topic, which is the poignant example of human suffering in your books.
Yes.
No, it's just that your books, especially the Dave ROBICHEAUX series, I feel like are such a great example of the human tragedy, of human suffering. And I know that there's a bit of you in Dave ROBICHEAUX and a bit of Dave ROBICHEAUX in you. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, I'd like to claim credit for Dave ROBICHEAUX's virtues, because he's an honorable and decent and very good person. But I'm afraid I have to claim the character defects are mine. I don't
both
know
the flaws
many
and
of his virtues are mine. But the character, Dave ROBICHEAUX, I think is a successful one, because he's the figure out of the everyman miracle or morality plays of the Middle Ages. He's more of a witness to history than a participant. And there are 21 books with this new one in the series, and they're each meant to be contemporaneous and to stand each on its own. And that's what I think has made it a series. The books are really about neo-colonialism. They're about national issues. And they're also about struggle for control of the earth, because I think that's the issue. That is the issue. T.E. Lawrence, you remember Lawrence of Arabia?
Of course, yeah.
Famous British soldier. In 1915, he said the issue is oil. It's oil, it's energy, or extractive industries. 1915. That's what the Great War was about. It began with, of course, the shooting of the Arch Ferdinand. But that's what the Great War was about. And that's what the Second World War was about. And the Indo-Chinese wars. And the same wars we are in now have the same origin. Nothing has changed in all that time. And a different, I think guise is put on it, or disguise is used, to mask the real issues. But the issue is energy in minerals.
Right.
And that's it. And that's where we are. And that's what the books have always been about. We're walking in the same sand, same footsteps that where the British trod and the French trod, and I think we'll come to the same end.
Now, you mentioned that, the books can be read individually. Is that a challenging thing to do for someone to, writing it, even though it's a part of a series that someone could pick up, let's say Sunset Limited, without having read the 9 previous novels? Is that hard to do to make it to where each time they pick it up, it's they feel like it's a new experience?
Well, it is. It's a challenge. See, there are 21 books. And so a person who writes a series using the same first-person narrator has to reestablish for the new reader the events that have gone before, the environment the story takes place in, the characters who are omnipresent, like Cleet Purcell and Batiste and the raccoon tripod. But the writer has to be able to do that without seeming redundant. So that's the challenge.
Can you take me through your time in college? I know you went to both UL, or at that time it was it USL?
Southwest Louisiana Institute.
Okay, it was SLI?
Yeah.
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 And then you went to the University of Missouri as well?
That's correct.
So were you majoring in writing, literature, English? What were you doing?
Well, let's see, I declared, what was my major? Pre-law when I was at SLI, but I never got to law school. But I was not a good student in high school. I graduated in the bottom quarter of my class because I majored in wood shop and study hall and homeroom. But I really had a hard time when I got to college. And SLI was a good school. It was, a school that gave opportunity to a lot of kids who came from poor background. I mean, they were born poor. I mean, nobody had any money back then.
Right.
Not much. Anyway, but see, complete tuition for one semester was $55, and room and board for a month was just $50. I mean, man, that was a real bargain.
Yeah, that seems like it. It
So
seems unheard
a lot
of.
kids, I couldn't have gone to, certainly a school like Tulane or, any number of. I couldn't have gotten in them either because my grades were so low. But by midterm, I was really worried because I was getting D minuses on every one of my essays in my English class. And I went to see the professor. Her name was Lyle Williams, Ms. Lyle Williams. And she was very proper and a really nice lady, but she had a high standard. And my essay looked like a disemboweled animal. There was so much red ink on it. And I said, Ms. Williams, I don't understand why I keep getting D minuses every week. And this is what she said. She put on her glasses and first looked up and down the pages, then said, Mr. Burke, your penmanship is an assault upon the eyeballs. Your spelling makes me wish the Phoenicians did not invent the alphabet. But you write with such heart, I couldn't give you an F.
How
and
nice,
anyway,
how nice.
She made me a deal. She said, I'll make you a deal. She said, if you'll come to my office every Saturday morning and we'll go over your essay and your errors, and if you'll rewrite it, we'll take another look at your grade at the end of the term. And I made a B, as in bravo, in Ms. Williams' English class, and I made the Dean's Honor Roll. I had never had any achievement like that in my life, and it changed my whole life.
So
no doubt.
Without Miss Williams, do you think you would have just never pursued it? I mean, so she basically, was that the first time you had ever heard that your writing had heart? You know, you were struggling with the grammar, but was that the first time you really heard that?
Well, I would have flunked out had it not been for Ms. Williams because I couldn't spell. I didn't know punctuation. I just I wasn't illiterate, but I was making I'm a D minus. D is in dumb. A gift. I should have been getting F's. So, but Ms. Williams gave me, encouragement, and she was a great teacher. And we read the Odyssey, we read Homer and William Faulkner. We read John Stuart Mill, Samuel Coleridge, Francis Bacon. This was in a freshman English class in a little college down in the Deep South. I mean, how many university students read those authors today? And the kids in the class came from Cajun homes, and they were North Louisiana farm boys and girls, and but it was nobody had any money. I mean, most of those kids, as I, could not have gone to a more expensive school. So SLI did an enormous lot of good for a huge number of Louisiana young people. And it still does. It's a great place.
Well, it's incredible.
Go ahead.
There.
Yeah.
Well, it's incredible because, like you said, you're reading Faulkner, and there's so much Faulkner that bleeds into your work now that it seems that those times of learning about him and reading that work in at that freshman year has certainly inspired you a lifetime worth of work. Correct?
Well, I admire Faulkner. He's probably our greatest writer. I mean, he could be compared to Shakespeare and to Geoffrey Chaucer. He's one of the greatest writers in the history of the English language. But the greater influence on my work came from Ernest Hemingway, Flannery O'Connor, Tennessee Williams, I would say, certainly James T. Farrell, Thomas Wolfe, of course, Eudora Welty was a great, story writer, but Robert Penn Warren. But the Southern Renaissance had a lot of influence on my work, but ultimately I would say the other was the Jesuit poet, Gerard Manley Hopkins. He was known as a metaphysical poet. His notebooks and poems had a lot of influence, and I would think the person I wanted to write like most was F. Scott Fitzgerald. Jack Kerouac was, maybe a little bit of a later influence, but much later.
And also, your dad was a natural gas engineer, correct?
That's right. Yeah.
And but I'd heard you at one point say that he had ambitions to become a journalist or a historian and just never was able to do it because of various things. And so do you find that you took on that role because, you're not a journalist or a historian, but an author, but being into that writing role because he maybe missed out on his opportunity? I mean, was he just not able to because of the time, or they needed the money? What was it?
Well, it was, as you say, the latter. My father always wanted to be a journalist and a historian, and he was very great. He wrote very good prose, and he was one of the most intelligent people I ever knew. Maybe he's the most intelligent person I ever knew. And he was prescient about history. He knew the future. I never knew anyone like him in that regard. It's like he opened a door into things that were about to happen. And he used to say that art and science are the incremental discovery of what already exists. And he said it's all out there. It's waiting for you. But he was a sugar chemist in Cuba and a natural gas engineer for a big pipeline company. And he hated it. He hated the work that he did. But see, he had a job during the Depression when I was born. And we didn't have any money. I mean, no one did back then. But if your dad had a job in the Depression, you were in tall cotton. So he was not a man. He was a family man. He couldn't take a risk by, trying to, make a living as a writer. And so he worked all of his life there in a job that he hated. He literally hated it. He'd come home and he wouldn't. He'd stay by himself. He wouldn't say anything bad about the job, and he'd wash his hands angrily. He didn't have dirt on him. He was the assistant to the vice president of the company, but he worked in the field. But I mean, he was out there on the ground with the rigs, but he was theirs, but he would try to wash the industry off of his hand. He hated what he did. And he used to always tell me that. He'd say, "Son, don't ever work at a job you don't want, you don't like." But see, those people of that generation, though, were just thankful that they had employment.
Of course, yeah.
So I've been very fortunate, but it's almost impossible to work at one job and then write as a career when you have to do it when you're tired. I was really fortunate. I was able finally I had some commercial success, and I could write full time. I was 53 when I quit teaching, and was able to write full time. I wrote all those years, and I had many kinds of jobs, but it's really hard. You get up and try to do it before you go to work, and you can do lots of things well if you're tired, but write well is not one of them.
Right. Was he still around when you were able to have some of your first published books? Was he alive?
No. I wish he had seen that, but no, he died when I was 18. He died as a result of an accident.
On a oil rig or what?
Well, he was on the job, but it was many years ago. It was 2 weeks before my 19th birthday. It was 3 weeks before my 19th birthday. Yeah. He was a good person. He was a really good man.
It certainly sounds like, I mean, just you talking about him, and he seemed like, it just doesn't seem like he's a guy from, or an adult in the 1930s in the sense where he was doing the job because he had to, but he was so well-rounded, and he was a visionary, and he had visions for the future that, as you were describing, that just doesn't seem to fit with the zeitgeist of the time. He was ahead of his time in a way.
That's correct, but as such, he was a lonely man. I'll never forget what he said at the close of World War II. It was right after VJ Day, victory over Japan, and everyone was ecstatic, of course, naturally. But I remember these were his words. I'm paraphrasing, but it's probably close to a literal quote. He said, "The great powers are gone." He said, "Britain," he said, "and France are gone." And he said, "The Axis have been destroyed, but now Russia will make its move." And then he added, he said, "They will not confront the United States directly. They will use surrogates. They will use third world insurgencies to bleed us white. We will die the death of 1,000 cuts." And he said, "Ultimately, our only foreign policy will be a return to the isolationist years of the Monroe Doctrine, but our policy will be based on weakness and not strength, and we will be destroyed from within." Those were his words, 1945. But he said, Russia will use surrogates.
He's a smart man.
He was a smart man, you see. But others had no idea what he was talking about. But where are we right now? What's our relationship with a man like Vladimir Putin?
Right.
I wonder what my dad would have to say.
I'm sure he knows what he's talking about.
He did, but you see, he had a classical education. He had read the work of the Greeks and the Romans. He had an enormous knowledge about history. But my best work are the 3 novels that were published between the previous ROBICHEAUX book, Light of the World, and the one that just came out. But my best work consist of the Holland trilogy, Wayfaring Stranger, House of the Rising Sun, and The Jealous Kind.
Mm-hmm.
And The Jealous Kind includes a story of a teenage boy and the father figure who works for a pipeline. He's a natural gas engineer and something of a historian. He always wrote, by himself and late at night. But anyway, that's my best work, actually, but it has not had the commercial success of the ROBICHEAUX series, which I think is very good. But the trilogy is far beyond anything else I've written.
That seems to happen a lot, too, with artists or anyone in the creative industry writing, is that they have their best works and they aren't commercially successful until much later in life. Is that what you're finding with these?
Well, the others have been successful. I mean, they may... Two of the trilogy were on the New York Times best-selling list. My best book, the best book I've written, is House of the Rising Sun. It's the only one that has not been on the New York Times list in over 20 years.
That gets you pretty tickled.
The New York Times once referred to William Faulkner as the poet of the Southern dung heap. Did you know that? And he was out of print 1 year before he won the Nobel Prize for Literature. He was out of print. You know what my father used to say? If everyone agrees on something, it's wrong.
Right.
That's what he said.
Well, that's interesting too, because I mean, for you were you were out of print before let's see, it was the Lost Get Back Boogie. And,
that's right. Yeah.
And you got rejected, what was it, 111 times?
That book was, yes, under submission for 9 years with my current agent, with whom I've been this month, 40 years. But he was driving a cab in Hell's Kitchen when I met him. He ran a one-man cab service in the day, and he was an agent at night. He had one in Hell's Kitchen. But that's how we met, and we've been together all these years.
So similar to...
Right in the middle, but he sold the Lost Get... Actually, my wife. Anyway, he had it submitted 111 times, and then it was nominated for a Pulitzer after it was published by LSU Press. LSU Press brought me back into print. But I had a lot of success when I was young, you see, but I hit a period and I couldn't sell anything for 13. I couldn't sell Ice Water in Hell. I wrote a number. I don't know how many stories and novels I could not sell. But out of the novels I did not sell, and they're still unpublished, I created the Dave ROBICHEAUX series.
So,
and you see, that changed everything. The Lost Get Back Boogie and a collection of stories were published by LSU Press, and then a New York publisher, Henry Holt, published The Neon Rain, and that changed everything.
Right, because you struck success pretty early with Half of Paradise, right? I mean, you had written that one at like 23, but when was it actually published?
It took 5 years to get it into print. It was rejected a lot before it got to Houghton Mifflin published it, and my first review was a 6-column banner review in the New York Times. That book, and then I remember Library Journal said a new talent has risen on the literary horizon. That's one of the kindest lines I think anyone ever wrote about my work. But and I looked at those reviews. Oh, gee, this is nice. Well, I'm on board now, and I published 2 more books in New York, and then wow, I wrote the Lost Get Back Boogie, and then
it brought you back down to reality.
That brought me to back to reality.
I mean, you were young, you were doing well, and you were high on that energy, and then it really and then it was 9 years of just trying to get anything published. I mean, what is that? That's got to be pretty dark at that point when you feel like you've had success, and then you're immediately turned back to, trying to sell something like you're a nobody.
It's like being rich twice and going broke 3 times. That's what it was like.
That's a really good way to put it.
It was 13 years that I was out of hardback print. But and as I say, I wrote during all those years.
So, I mean, what was your wife at that point? Was she sticking by and saying, "Look, just keep submitting," or was it hard? We got to make money somehow. What is that 13-year period like?
Well, I can say without exaggeration, my wife Pearl and I next month we will have been married 58 years. We lived and worked everywhere, from the east to the west coast and everywhere in between, and did every dirty job there was. We did it with children, and it's not a brag, it's just a fact. It's the way it was, but we did it. And my family was always behind me, you see, and I can never repay the debt because, we didn't have any money, and we lived in, we lived in Appalachia in a trailer, Okie motels, in a slum in Los Angeles, in what was essentially a garage. We did it, and we learned a lot about the other America, but I wouldn't want to do it again.
Right, you lived through it once, and that was enough. But that passion and having to get through that, it definitely translate into passionate writing. So it's one of those things where it's, I don't know, and I look at other authors and other things, and it's like everyone has something that they had to get through, and it bettered their writing. And so you don't wish it upon anyone, but it's almost like a rite of passage in a way.
Well, that's correct. That's well said. And I didn't mean to indicate a legacy. I mean a litany of grief here. My point was that I've been very fortunate, though. I mean, there are people who have overcome far more than I, who have not received the awards I have, but rewards that I have come to me. So I feel an enormous sense of gratitude to many things, to the good people that were always behind my work. And you see that oftentimes those people don't get much credit, the booksellers, the editor,
the agent that stuck with you, those kind of people, right?
That.
Yeah.
But you learn, it's a lesson in life, I guess. Yes, you can have all the friends you want when you're in tall cotton, but real friends are the people who knew you years ago when you had little and were struggling, and they stayed with you in the lean times. See, and you never forget those kind. You can have all the friends in the world if you bring your checkbook.
Right.
But I was very fortunate, though, in that as a younger man, I did meet the underside of America, and I don't mean underside in a bad way. It's the other America. People have no voice. I lived in Appalachia and knew coal miners who had silicosis. In fact, every one of them did. They all had it to some degree. And I saw the conditions of people who lived in dirt floor cabins. I worked in the Job Corps, and I was hired by the Office of Equal Opportunity. But I lived in a slum and saw what it was like in Los Angeles.
Right. I mean, you were a social worker on Skid Row, correct?
Correct. And I worked in the South Side where we lived, and suddenly I understood the anger that these people feel. I mean, I saw it, the injustice and the cruelty and the predatory nature of the economics. See, there's a lot of money to be made as a slumlord, for example, or as a vendor. That has to do with money lending, prostitution, stores that they sell their stale bread or, lettuce that's brown around the edges. They dump it in the South or East L.A. But also the slum lords. See, they make fortunes off of slum property. Why? The tax base is very low. There's no overhead. They never fix anything. When they get tired of the, fooling with the property, they'll hire a torch and burn it and take the insurance money. But also, you see, a welfare recipient is the best tenant any slumlord could have, because the check is in the mailbox on the 4th day of every month. And I used to make out rent budgets all the time to property owners who lived in the Wilshire district or in Beverly Hills. But that's how it works. And the people who live down there live in that place Michael Harrington referred to as the other America. And we look at the last election. Well, why did a lot of people vote in the way they did? Well, they've lost their jobs. They live in the Rust Belt. Their unions are gone, and many of them have nothing to look forward to. And so what do? They say, well, roll the dice, and it can't be any worse than what's happening to me now. I mean, of course, the result I don't think was very good, but that's what occurs when people feel they have no voice, that they're not a part of the larger society. They get angry. The Black Panthers understood that. Huey Newton, I said if you want to start a revolution, just stand at the jailhouse door and sign up every guy coming out of the can.
Right.
It's terrible when you got to look to Huey Newton for political wisdom.
Yeah, exactly. Now, how does a Cajun boy become a social worker in Los Angeles? What steps do you have to take to do that?
Well, not much to it. It was a civil service job. I went to Los Angeles. I was a land surveyor in Colorado and Texas, and then I ran out of work in Colorado. Winter was coming. But anyway, I couldn't get in the union in L.A., and so when I was filing my insurance application, the guy at the Labor Department said, "You have a college degree?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, you can do this stuff." And I said, "Well, okay." So I filled out a form to work for the state employment office there, and I'd done that actually in Louisiana. No, I had not then. But anyway, the guy he said, "Look, you could be a social worker too if you like." And I said, "Well, that sounds even better." And that's how I became one. But it was quite an experience. These are the people who have no voice. But I also worked with parolees and criminally insane and former felons and every kind of person in the world. And you learn an old lesson, or for me it was a new lesson, that you never judge anyone, and that any of us, except for chance and accident, could be in the shoes of some poor fella standing in a relief line, and people who are just like us. There's no difference. You learn that quickly about the criminal population, that most of them are just hapless people. They have banana peels for fingers. They break into jails, not out. But there's another group inside there that stays in lockdown. I mean, they're psychotic and dangerous and arguably just simply evil. But they are treated that way inside the institution. But most of the people in there, if you turn them loose, who make no difference, they just hapless guys that on a good day need a diagram to tie their shoestrings.
Right.
But the days of Bonnie and Clyde are over. Street dealers and petty criminals. But most of it has to do with alcohol and narcotics. 85% of felons are in inside because of crimes they committed while under the influence.
Certainly in Louisiana.
Yeah, that's it. But it's everywhere in the United States.
Yeah.
The conduit into the problem is often narcotics more than anything, I think. It's systemic. It's in the culture, and we've kind of put a blue wall around it, and tried to isolate it, in the interior of our cities, but it's pervasive in our culture.
And it's interesting hearing you talk about these kind of statistics. You seem to know a lot about, not only crime but police and all that kind of stuff. And I know with Dave Robichaux's, your first, Neon Rain was your first crime novel, correct?
Yeah, I mean, one that would be defined as such. My other three books are actually crime novels too, but the narrator was not an attorney or was not a policeman. The only change really in my work was using a police officer as a narrator, but sometimes Dave is not a police officer. He's been kicked off of the force. And
right.
He's in Montana or Colorado or Florida.
But you're very knowledgeable about that. I mean, did you have to study police procedural and all that kind of stuff before you got into the whole Dave Robichaux series?
I taught police officers 9 years at Miami-Dade in Miami, Florida, in a school, a junior college that was an adjunct of the Miami Police Academy. So I had police officers I didn't have a room full of police officers, but many police officers took classes there at our school. And so I was also a police reporter, and as I said, I worked in concert, at least, with California Parole and Probation. I had some really interesting guys, what they call second story guys. But I worked with murderers too, all kinds of people. But many times men who would be considered recidivist. There was one fellow's case I had. He did 18 years for rape. And I won't use his name, but he might still have family around. But
sure.
There was a Jewish fella in Santa Monica who ran a catering service, and he was a man who just did an enormous amount of good for people. And he would hire former felons, guys on parole, to work in his catering business. So this guy, the convicted rapist, Frank, said, I picked up his case, and he said, Miss Burke, he said, I don't want to go back inside. And he told me also, he said that he was innocent. He actually did not rape that woman. He said, and he added, he said, I committed other crimes, and maybe they were even more serious, but I didn't do that one. But anyway, he said, I'm on the square with you. And I believed him. But anyway, I called up this man who owned the catering service and told him about Frank. And Santa Monica's a long way from downtown L.A. But we put Frank up in a hotel and gave him bus tokens so he could ride to work. And he disappeared for about a month. I thought, oh, geez, he's probably going back inside.
Right.
And one morning, the intake person downstairs called upstairs to my desk and said, Frank is down there. He wants to see you. And I said, what's going on? He said, I don't know. He just said he wants to see you. So I went downstairs, and there was Frank. And he said, Mr. Burke, he said, I've worked out real well with this man in Santa Monica. He's promoting me, and he's going to keep me there permanent. And I just wanted to tell you how much I appreciate what you did. And I said, well, I'm really proud of you, Frank, and I feel honored. And I said, look, you need some bus tokens? Because I knew he had, he still was riding the bus. He said, no, sir. And he reached in his pocket. He had a whole handful of quarters. And I've got my own money these days. He said, but thank you anyway. I'll never forget that.
Oh, that's incredible.
Yeah. But just one break, seeing that Jewish man who had that catering service, who a fellow that probably had suffered himself, at the hands of anti-Semitic people, but has devoted his life to doing good works. It changed Frank's life. And our program helped along, but it was this man in Santa Monica that an angel in our presence. St. Paul says something very good about that. He said, there may indeed be angels living among us, so we should be careful how we treat one another.
That's a smart way to look at it. You've had so many different jobs. I believe you were a truck driver at one point, teacher, social worker, police reporter. Is there any one that you feel has influenced your writing the most, or do you think it's kind of the combination of all the various things you've done that have added to your work?
Well, I think maybe all of the above. I learned a lot about working people, and I learned a lot about exploitation of people too. People who are underpaid. And I saw things where people were exploited, and I saw it everywhere, and how the law would be used to deny people what should have been theirs. So I learned a lesson about the haves and the have-nots. And as I say, I lived in South LA, which was, the streets were run by the gangs. They weren't called the Bloods and the Crips back then, but it was the same kind of
right
culture. And I saw how the slum lords worked, and I saw many things that I would write later on in my books, and how the system is often used to not protect the defenseless and those whom the government you think would guarantee justice, but instead they are not treated fairly. And it's often factored into the system. Oh Lordy, I remember people in Louisiana there. The poor people couldn't read or write over around Crowley, Acadia Parish. And they worked in the canneries, and when the cannery would be shut down for the season, and they'd be laid off, and they would think they would be covered, under unemployment insurance. And these people were dirt poor.
Right.
I mean, they hardly spoke English. This was, back in many years ago. And then they would discover 2 weeks after they would apply that the state law did not cover them, that they were considered seasonal workers, and as such, unless they had worked at other places in the required time length, they would receive no unemployment benefits, and it'd be devastated. And you see, normally anywhere, if you're laid off a job, I mean, if you just had that job one day and you get laid off, and you had built up contributions to the unemployment insurance fund, you'd be able to get unemployment insurance. But I see them walk out of the office just stunned. They had no money to buy food or pay rent. Back then, this was 1965 in that area, in the cane fields, the pay per day was $5 for a white or a black person, and it was full day's work was $5. That was it. And the average pay for people working in restaurants, any kind of manual work, house cleaning, was around maximum $25 a week, sometimes for a 6-day week. That's a fact.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it is.
It's something you're very passionate about, because it's not just a theme that is obviously evident in your writing, but hearing you talk about it now, I mean, I could just hear it in your voice. It's something that you're extremely passionate about, righting those wrongs and that kind of thing.
Well, it's William Faulkner in his Nobel Prize speech, made that famous address about the duty of the poet, is to somehow contribute to our collective consciousness and conscience, that we have to be aware that the earth is a gift, and that if we exploit our fellow man and we exploit the earth itself, eventually we're undoing what is the very purpose of creation, at least as we know it. I think all this around us was created for some reason. We have to be good stewards, not simply of the earth, but of our fellow man. We have to be aware that there's great suffering in the world. I mean, here's the statistic. 90% of the Earth's resources are used by only 10% of the population. And that population is in the Atlantic Community of Nations, better said, comprises 10% of the world's population, but it uses 90% of the world's resources. Mm-hmm. There's something wrong. And this is what the series is about. It's about neo-colonialism.
Can you tell me about, as well, your Catholicism and how that has been implemented into your writing?
Well, it's like taking your own inventory. Not very objective. I think of I use the term Catholic as in its original meaning as it means universal. That's how it was used. There was a dispute, I think, between the leadership in Jerusalem, in Antioch, and in Rome. And I forget, I think it was St. Polycarp who used the term Catholic. See, we're all a member of the same club, you see. But I don't think of myself as put it this way. I hope I'm not a polemic writer, but there's no doubt, like in the Dave ROBICHEAUX books, in the Holland books, I guess all of them, that you see, it's my belief that I try to be a good Christian. I don't want to. I don't want to really talk about myself in this regard, because they're far better people than I who could address what are the obligations of a Christian. Mm-hmm. But put it this way, in the books, there is no question at all that what I see as the essence of the Catholic Church, so this is my view, okay. It's not an institution. The Catholic Church, to me, are the martyrs, the Maryknolls who died in Central America, the women like Saint Perpetua and Saint Felicity, who were martyred in the 3rd century, for their faith. The early Christian community there just comprised, they were all working people. That for me is the Catholic Church. The other things are fine, I'm sure, but for me, it's those guys, it's working people, and it's women. And you see, if it were not for women, there would be no Catholic Church. And if it were not for the kind of people who died in Central America, who were abandoned, really, by their government, and I didn't see any outcry in the churches there about the murder of our people with weapons that we gave these killers in El Salvador, and they were trained at the School of the Americas at Fort Benning. I heard no outrage about any of that. But nonetheless, I think at the core of Christianity, and I believe it's one club, and it's something that The membership requires that a person step across a line at some point and say, I'm a member of the kingdom, and I'll never change the earth, but it will not, I will never change the world, but it will not change me. It's that simple. And that's when you take on, you make your troth. You take an oath at that point. You accept the ethos of the Templar Knight. That's it. That's it.
Beautiful.
It's that simple.
Yeah.
You see, so
Yeah.
that's what Dave Robichaux is. He is the egalitarian knight. He's the good knight in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. He's the everyman. He's the one who speaks for people who have no voice. And he's unflinching when it comes to principle, and he has his flaws. But this is the point of the tragic hero. This is the Promethean hero. That, in effect, yes, he'll give his life for humanity, but he's often undone by a flaw within himself. And with Dave, it is overextending himself. But nonetheless, we admire him. It's people like, put it this way, the people who have led us away from ourselves are those whom we admire in retrospect, but in their own time, we have a way of hanging them on crosses. we wait till we're down history to anoint them, but I'm sure if Jesus comes back right now, he would suffer the same fate, and the same kind of people would be on his case.
Indeed. That's a very good way to put it.
Same bud.
Yeah, yeah.
Same guys always trying to work a deal, work the angle.
Oh, absolutely. It would be history repeating itself.
You shake hands with them and you feel grease all over your palm. You know, you go home and spray yourself with Lysol, you know.
It's wonderful getting to hear your perspective on things, so I appreciate you delving into it and allowing me to speak to you about that. Do you mind if we talk a little bit about your writing process? Do you have time?
Yeah, sure. Well, I write all the time. That's a literal fact. I write 7 days a week, and I write night and day. I worked at 4:30 this morning, and I got up at 8:30, got back on it. I fed the horses. I'll be writing this afternoon, and I'll be doing it probably something tonight, but I do it all around the clock, and I never stop.
It's an obsession?
Yeah, that's it. It's an obsession.
Now,
It's an obsession.
do you prefer longhand, or have you moved on to computers, or are you still on a typewriter? What do you like to write with?
Well, I moved from finally I gave up the typewriter and I bought a computer, and it's great, but I write in longhand. What I wrote at 4:30 this morning was in longhand, and I have a lot of notebooks. They're filled.
Mm-hmm.
I keep them all, but each I've usually fill in. Two novels will fill a row. The notes for one notebook will usually make two novels.
Gotcha. And you will do that for your first draft and then transcribe it into the computer, or what do you do?
Oh, I just I write things out. Yes, and then I rewrite the next morning, though.
Mm-hmm.
I will write in a notebook, go to the computer, the typewriter, and then rework it the next morning. And then I rework smaller things late at night sometimes. But Shakespeare said, all power lies in the world of dreams. And that's why I keep a pen next to my bed, and I have a lamp on a night table next to my bed, because it's in the unconscious where we find both the stories and the characters. They're always there. They're in the unconscious. I believe that we have, I think there's specters out there in the mist. I believe, I subscribe to my father's belief that he said he did not think that time was sequential. He believed that all events happened simultaneously, as he said, as though a dream in the mind of God. And I believe that. I
Yeah.
think that's why people see things, that the unborn are out there. And the people who lived thousands of years ago are sitting around. And I think they're there. And I don't think anything we believe is probably correct, the nature of reality. I mean, Einstein said that. He believed that straight lines, parallel lines, met on the edges of infinity. That nothing is as we think it is.
Yeah.
And so when people start telling me what is the absolute truth about anything in particular, I have to say things like, I'm sorry, I didn't realize it. I'm so late. I've got to go home and color match my socks now.
Moving on to ROBICHEAUX, I do want to talk a little bit about that before you have to go. So I'm going to read off a few things that some people have said. James Lee Burke is the heavyweight champ, a great American novelist whose work, taken individually or as a whole, is unsurpassable. That was Michael Connolly.
Yeah.
Stephen King said, a gorgeous prose stylist. And in an interview with John Grisham, when they said, who are your favorite writers, your name was included among those of Steinbeck and John Irving, Michael Lewis, Pat Conroy. I know you, like we talked about, writing is an obsession. It's not, you're not doing it for the recognition or for the awards, but that's got to feel pretty good that, people are appreciating the work that you're putting out there.
Well, it does, and it's, very laudatory and complimentary and kind of all those people you mentioned. I know Michael, but I mean, Michael's straight shooter. I mean,
he wouldn't
a great
lie.
Compliment. He's from it on it. He's a good guy.
Yeah.
I never met Mr. Steve King or John Grisham, but I wrote him a thank you note just about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and he wrote me a very nice letter back. And I also wrote Stephen King, whom I don't know, and he wrote me back, and they're nice, but it's a great honor. Men of their stature, their success did not come easy.
No.
Michael was a police reporter at the L.A. Times and family man. He still is, and Steve King really worked hard. Gee whiz. I mean, it's one of those stories you can't believe.
Yeah, that's right.
His wife worked double shifts as a waitress, when he got his first royalty check, it was for, golly, the girl who wrecks the high school.
Carrie.
His wife was working double shifts, as I remember the story, and he was, I think, teaching at a junior college, like a substitute, something like that. But they were dead broke. They couldn't even pay the electric bill. And the agent called Steve King and said, look, you're going to be happy. You're going to be happy. I just got a paperback deal because we're really doing well with the hardback sale on Carrie, maybe a movie deal hanging. I got you $300. And King said, $300? That's wonderful. I'm going to call my wife. We're going to go out to dinner. He said, no, it's $300,000. And he fainted. He was using a payphone, and he fell backwards and actually hit the floor with the back of his head. He passed out. He was so shocked.
Well, I remember reading that, in his autobiography, and it just shows that, when you're worked that hard and you're that poor, and you're at that point you're questioning, whether you can continue doing what you're doing because you're making no money from it, but you're so passionate about it. So I can imagine what that moment was like. Yeah, and when he wrote about it, it was incredible. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're real quick, I want to talk about the film characters, the film adaptations of a few of the Dave Robichaux books. Have you enjoyed being able to see, it was, what was it, Tommy Lee Jones and Alec Baldwin have taken Dave Robichaux to the big screen. Have you enjoyed seeing your writing on.
Oh yeah. It's a great pleasure and honor. Know that your work's been adapted for a film, and you see the characters actually moving around up there on the screen, and people enjoy the film, and Lordy, and I've had 3 adaptations made, one by Turner for a movie for television, 2 for Texas, about the Texas Revolution, and but yeah, it's a lot of fun, and that's that. If you let it be that. Burt Reynolds said something I never forgot. Why grow up when you can make movies?
He would. That's such a Burt Reynolds quote. Let's talk a little bit about ROBICHEAUX, the new novel. It's coming out January 2nd, correct?
Yeah, January 2nd.
January 2nd, it'll be available. That's 2018 in case people are listening in the future. And so tell me a little bit about, this novel.
Yeah, it looks like it's going to do quite well. The advanced reviews are just about the best I've received on any book in the Dave ROBICHEAUX series, and almost all people who have read it and commented on it indicate it's the best in the series. I think it is politically, that's a bad term, and culturally, it deals more with contemporaneous events than any of the other books does. All right, why is that? It deals with the appearance of a demagogue in Louisiana, a man running for the United States Senate. He's from St. Mary Parish of Franklin. He's a very wealthy man, made his money in the casino industry. Dave ROBICHEAUX always has admired him. His name is Jimmy Nightingale. He's an anesthetically mixed man. He seems to be haunted by guilt of some kind. But he makes a choice, a deliberate choice, to inculcate fear and division or divisiveness in the electorate. And he makes use of race, xenophobia, immigration, all of the fears that normally are hiding on the edges of people's consciousness. He knows how to give them new life. He has 3 antecedents: Huey Long, George Wallace, and Senator Joseph McCarthy.
Right.
Except Dave feels, and Clete Purcell in particular feels, that Jimmy Nightingale is going to go through the Senate like a hot knife through butter, that his aim is the White House. And Jimmy Nightingale is a very disturbing guy. And what is more disturbing for Dave in the book is the fact that people he loves, people with whom he grew up, are willing to set aside their judgment, their reason, and their humanity ultimately, and listen to this man who is he's the harbinger of misery and racial strife and all of the things we thought we got rid of or were working on getting rid of. And you see, it's like going back to the Confederate flag again. It's suddenly we feel the issues that we thought we were getting beyond are suddenly not just simply in our midst, but are coming to define us in the eyes of the rest of the world. And that's why Clete tells Dave, I'm going to cancel this guy's ticket. Clete keeps it simple.
Clete is such a wonderful character throughout all the books. You have to know a Clete in real life, don't you? I mean, there's just no one like him.
It's like every high school has one guy like that.
Exactly.
When you look back,
exactly.
Remember, all you had to do was dare him, and he would say, "I'm on it."
Yeah, exactly. Everyone that reads any of the books with Clete, they will say, "All right, well, that's this person." They know exactly who it is.
I went to school with this guy. He drove a concrete mixer, through the side of the wall.
Right, exactly. Exactly. I am extremely thrilled to have you on the podcast, and I can't wait to finish ROBICHEAUX over the holidays, and January 2nd is when it comes out, so I urge everyone to go out and get themselves a copy, because at least what I've read so far has been great. It's James Lee Burke at his finest, and I appreciate you so much for coming on the podcast and talking to me. I really could talk to you for hours. It's been so interesting, and I hope this isn't the last time we get to communicate.
Come see us in Montana, Brennan.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Sheauxtime. The podcast is sponsored by no one. Well, not yet at least, but it could be you or your business. So if you know someone, or if you are interested in sponsoring this podcast, get in touch with me. SheauxtimePodcast@gmail.com. Sheauxtime spelled SHEAUX time podcast. Also, if you're enjoying the podcast, one of the ways you can really help me out is by making sure you're subscribed to it on iTunes or whatever podcast app you use. It's free and super easy to do, but it helps us out a ton. And if you're really enjoying the podcast, you can leave us a review or a rating on iTunes and on Facebook. It really only takes about 15 seconds. Here, go ahead and do it. I'll wait. Did you do it yet?